At 41, Eleanor Vance had mastered the art of looking calm while internally screaming. But even my carefully constructed facade was crumbling. My burgundy dress, a heavy silk in the color of old, expensive wine, was ruined, not by spilled champagne, but by 17 seconds. 17 seconds I had meticulously counted, each one ticking by like a death knell while I stood frozen in the corner of the Chicago Grand Hotel's ornate conference room. The dress itself was supposed to make me feel powerful. Instead, it felt like a target. I remember the exact moment the clock stopped. It was 8:45 p.m. I'd walked over to Arthur, my husband of 14 years, who was holding court near the window with 3 junior VPs and his best friend, Todd. I'd seen him pour himself his 3rd whiskey, and the combination of the liquid and the corporate swagger was already making him loud. Too loud for a man of his supposed stature. "Hey, honey," I'd said softly, leaning close so only he could hear. "You know we have that early flight tomorrow. Maybe time to wrap it up." It was a suggestion, a gentle reminder designed to save him from himself, a habit I'd perfected over a decade of smoothing over his excesses. But tonight, in front of the people he needed to impress, he didn't want saving. He wanted spectacle. Arthur pulled his arm away from my light touch as if I were a stranger offering a pamphlet. He straightened his tie, the knot looking painfully tight beneath his arrogant jawline, and turned to face me fully. His eyes narrowed with that particular blend of irritation and condescension I had learned to dread. "Stop acting like you own me, Eleanor," he announced, his voice booming slightly, instantly silencing the group around him. The jazz quartet, playing a smooth rendition of something from the 60s, suddenly felt miles away. "You don't get to tell me where I go or who I'm with." The air went dead. The moment didn't just happen, it was engineered. He delivered the line with the theatrical flourish of a man who'd rehearsed it, a grand declaration of independence designed to make him look like a maverick escaping a controlling wife. He was sacrificing me, his partner, on the altar of his fragile masculinity. Then the laughter started. It wasn't a sudden, unified roar. It was a wave. First, a high-pitched, nervous titter from Todd, always the loyal lapdog. Then a deeper chuckle from one of the VPs. Soon, all 20 colleagues and clients in that immediate vicinity were dissolving into amusement. They weren't laughing with Arthur. They were laughing at the dynamic he had just exposed, and by extension at me. The woman in the expensive dress, the one who quietly funded half of his life, had just been publicly dismissed. I stood there, my burgundy silk feeling heavy and suffocating, my champagne flute trembling so violently I thought the crystal would shatter. I couldn't move. My consultant's mind, the one that built multi-million-dollar strategies, was frozen, cycling through the raw data. 17 seconds. That was the duration of my public humiliation. I locked the image of their faces into my memory. Todd, clinking his whiskey glass against Arthur's afterward in a gesture of toxic male solidarity. Chloe from accounting, her bright pink nails drumming nervously against her clutch as she actively avoided my gaze. I remember the air smelling of cinnamon and expensive, cheap cologne as my world cracked down the middle. I refused to let the tears fall, forcing myself to hold the fixed, polite smile that had been my armor for so long. But the armor had melted, and what was left was pure, exposed fury. The moment he finished basking in his self-declared victory, he turned back to his conversation, utterly dismissing me as if I were merely a clumsy waiter who had spilled something. "You're right," I heard a voice say, a voice so steady and low it barely registered as mine. "We're not together anymore." I placed the champagne flute down on a passing tray, the glass clicking against the silver with a finality that sounded deafening in my own ears. I didn't wait for his reaction, didn't turn back for a final shot. I simply walked. Each step on the thick, plush carpet was an act of severance, a physical cutting of the ties I had worn for too long. I walked out of the conference room, past the lobby, and straight into the cold, empty solitude of the parking garage. As I sat in the darkness of my car, the Chicago skyline a glittering, cruel tapestry outside, the first thing I did wasn't cry. It was making a phone call. The number I dialed belonged to Victoria Price, the sharpest divorce attorney in the city. By the time I ended the call, my contact made, my appointment booked, my face was streaked with hastily wiped mascara, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I had just traded 14 years of comfort for 72 hours of chaos, and I couldn't wait to watch the show. This was no longer about saving the marriage. It was about reclaiming the woman Arthur had tried to erase. The burgundy dress was officially retired. Tomorrow I was going shopping for armor. The morning after the humiliation arrived with the clinical precision of a scheduled surgery. At 5:45 a.m., I stood on the 25th floor of our luxury condo tower, the Chicago skyline spread out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the steel and glass monuments piercing the dawn fog like silent, accusatory witnesses. This apartment, this $2 million view, this entire foundation of our life, had been my father's final gift. My dad wasn't a corporate shark or a Wall Street titan. He was a construction foreman, a man who built things with his own two hands, who came home smelling of concrete, dust, and honest sweat. That condo, paid for with 30 years of calloused hands and a broken back, had been his legacy to me. Yet, over the years, the narrative in this home had shifted, contorted by Arthur's endless gaslighting. He called it our investment, his view, his success story. My name was on the deed, but he had managed to seize the perception of possession, and I, foolishly, had let him. I was making his coffee. 2 sugars, no cream. I counted back. 5,110 times over 14 years. This was number 5,111 and the last. My hands moved with a mechanical, ritualistic calm, a focus that masked the controlled demolition happening inside my head. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar, comforting morning song, oblivious to the fact that its routine was about to be obliterated. "Eleanor," his voice, rough with sleep and entitlement, drifted out from the room. "Coffee ready on the counter." I called back, my voice as steady and emotionless as a newscaster reading tragic stock ticker data. He emerged moments later, wearing nothing but his old Georgetown boxer shorts, stretching with the dedication of a man who believed physical perfection compensated for character deficiencies. At 41, he still had the chiseled look of the man I married, but now I saw only the hollow architecture beneath the surface. "What time did you finally get home last night?" he asked, grabbing the mug without looking at me, already scrolling through his phone. A casual, throwaway question. "Around 11, I lied easily. The truth was I'd spent 2 hours in the cold parking garage, setting up the legal framework for my escape, then sat in the lobby until 2 a.m. having a conversation with George, the doorman. That changed everything I thought I knew about Tuesday afternoons." Arthur grunted, acknowledging neither the time nor my presence. "Todd is sending over the investment paperwork today. I need your signature by 5. The demand hung in the air, thick and oppressive. It was the crux of their plan, to get the $500,000, my father's life, his broken back, to fund their crypto venture, a scheme that smelled like money laundering dressed in tech jargon. "I want to see the business plan first," I replied, my tone level. "Same as yesterday, same as last week." He finally looked up, his blue eyes narrowing with that patented blend of condescension and irritation. "We've been over this, Eleanor. Todd went to Wharton. He knows what he's doing." "So did the executives at Enron," I countered, not dropping my gaze. His jaw tightened. He set the coffee mug down with deliberate force, the sharp ceramic on granite a miniature thunderclap. "Why do you always have to make things so difficult? This is why I said what I said last night. You try to control everything." There it was, the well-worn bridge from humiliation to blame. He was blaming me for his public declaration, accusing me of being controlling for daring to ask basic questions about my own money. Humiliate, then blame. Demand, then accuse me of demanding. Take, then paint me as selfish for noticing. "You're right," I said, the words smooth as the silk of the dress I'd worn to my public execution. "I shouldn't try to control things, like my own inheritance, or my own life." He missed the edge entirely, already confident in his victory. "Exactly. When you're reasonable, everything works better." He walked over, pressed a dry, patronizing kiss to my forehead that felt like a stamp of ownership, and offered one last casual cruelty. "Wear that burgundy dress again tonight. Client party at the Marriott. It looked good on you. Powerful." The same dress. My uniform of humiliation. I'd be a walking reminder of the 17 seconds of laughter while he played the devoted husband. "I'll think about it," I managed, perfectly neutral. He walked back to the bedroom, dismissing me with the supreme confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of having his locks changed. "Don't overthink it, Eleanor. It's just a dress." But it wasn't just a dress. It was every small surrender, every swallowed objection, every time I'd made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. The burgundy dress was the latest costume in the theater of our marriage. My phone buzzed. A text from Victoria, room in my schedule at noon. Ready to proceed. I looked at his mug, still on the counter, then out at the sunrise painting the city gold. Everything looked different in this light. Temporary. Changeable. "Actually," I called toward the bedroom, loud enough to cut through the running shower, "I know exactly what I'm wearing tonight." What he didn't know was that I would be wearing it as a woman, not a wife. The coffee, now growing cold, was the last thing I would ever make for him. The 17 seconds of laughter were gone. All that remained was the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and certain, counting down to freedom. The hours between Arthur leaving for the office, a final, dismissive wave that felt like a goodbye from another life, and my meeting with Victoria were a blur of cold, calculated strategy. I bypassed my home office, knowing every wall held echoes of my husband's inflated ego, and set up temporary command on the granite counter where I'd made his last coffee. First, I downloaded every scrap of financial information I could find. Joint accounts, investment portfolios, the deed to the condo, my separate consulting business accounts. The goal wasn't just documentation, it was forensic analysis. I wasn't surprised to find his spending was reckless, his savings negligible. What shocked me was the systematic, almost invisible siphoning of funds from our joint account into a separate, unknown account over the last 6 months, small, frequent withdrawals of $700 or $1,200. It wasn't enough to trip an alert, but it added up. He wasn't just spending my money, he was actively stealing it. That clean, cold rage that had started in the parking lot intensified. At noon, I met Victoria Price in her downtown high-rise office. She was everything Arthur pretended to be. Sharp, confident, and genuinely successful. Her navy suit was armor, and her handshake was firm and devoid of pity. "Let's talk strategy, Eleanor," she said, cutting straight to the chase. He's arrogant. That's our weapon. I laid out the evidence. The public humiliation, multiple witnesses, the refusal to sign the $500,000 inheritance over to the sham crypto deal, the initial financial forensics. Victoria's eyebrows only rose once when I mentioned the hidden account. He's going to claim he's entitled to half the marital assets, especially the condo, as a high earner, she explained, tapping the deed. But the condo was a premarital gift to you from your father's inheritance, and you've covered all maintenance and mortgage with your income. The key is proving financial malfeasance and abandonment. I have a plan for the abandonment part, I said, pulling out the locksmith's card. We're changing the locks tonight. He's booked for another client party, so he won't be home until late. When he gets back, he'll find his key doesn't work and his belongings are in storage. Victoria smiled, a thin, approving curve of the lips. Self-help eviction. Bold. And legally sound, considering he was the one who publicly declared the marriage over. We file first thing tomorrow, citing constructive abandonment and financial misappropriation. We hit him with the papers while he's still reeling from the locked door. After the meeting, I felt an exhilarating lightness. The legal framework was set. Now for the logistics. My third call was to Maria, the locksmith. Midnight operation, I confirmed. Security is tight. Can you handle it? Honey, changing locks after midnight is my specialty. Maria's voice, warm and slightly gravelly, came through the line. My ex locked me out 17 years ago. I came home from my mother's funeral to my whole life on the front lawn. I learned this trade the next month. If I can't control much else, I can control who gets through my door. Her story wasn't meant to inspire, but it did. It was a solidarity forged in betrayal. The final piece of the plan involved an unexpected ally, George, the doorman. I stopped by the lobby on my way back up, offering him a $20 bill, a small gesture I usually saved for Christmas. George, I need a favor, I said, keeping my voice low. I'm taking a consulting call tonight, a big one. I need absolute privacy. If anyone tries to come up later, especially Mr. Stone, please tell them I can't be disturbed, that it's a critical high-level meeting. George, a man who'd seen everything in the building's 15-year history, simply nodded, his weathered face unreadable. Ms. Vance, you look tired. I gave him a weak smile. Just a long week. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Ms. Vance, I've worked here 15 years. I see a lot. I see the cars, I see the guests. He paused, looking down at his desk. Every Tuesday about 1:30 p.m., a young blonde woman from his office, Chloe, comes here, takes the service elevator. He follows 10 minutes later. They leave around 3:30 p.m. The world didn't stop. It accelerated. I knew it, deep down in the cold pit of my stomach, but hearing it, spoken by an objective, honest witness, was an entirely different kind of blow. How long, George? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. 6, maybe 7 months. Started right after your father's funeral. He looked up, his kind eyes flashing with a surprising, quiet anger. You deserve better than a man who can't even cheat with dignity. At least have the decency to go to a hotel, not the bed his wife sleeps in. The casual cruelty was staggering. I suddenly had a powerful, non-negotiable motive for the coming act of war. I immediately texted my brother, Marcus, who ran a self-storage facility near the airport. Need a storage unit, big enough for a man's entire life. By midnight, his reply was immediate. Done. Good for you, Eleanor. The stage was set. The legal documents were drafted. The locks were scheduled. And now I had the devastating evidence of the Tuesday afternoons, confirmed by a quiet, decent man who had been watching the performance from the wings for months. Tonight the fortress was coming down, and I would be the one holding the hammer. The second company party, held in the Marriott's grand ballroom, felt less like a social event and more like a return to the crime scene. Tonight I was dressed in the same burgundy silk, but it wasn't a uniform of humiliation anymore, it was armor. I had paired it with a gold cuff bracelet my father had given me years ago, a piece of honest jewelry that felt like a talisman against the corporate falseness surrounding us. Arthur's hand pressed against my lower back as we entered the ballroom, his fingers possessively spreading across the expensive fabric. The pressure used to feel protective. Tonight it felt like a stamp of ownership, the way a man might grip a briefcase full of money. He'd already had a couple of whiskeys in the limo, his breath hot and slightly slurred against my ear. "Remember, Eleanor, these are important clients," he murmured. "Try to be pleasant." Pleasant. The word was a swallowed glass shard after last night. I was about to deliver a sharp retort when I saw her. Chloe, the accounting clerk, stood near the bar. She was wearing a dress so similar to mine, the exact shade of burgundy, though with a plunging neckline and a hemline hiked up a scandalous few inches, that it couldn't be coincidence. It was a silent, aggressive declaration. She stood with her back to us, her blonde hair cascading down her spine, a waterfall of betrayal. Todd's wife, Melissa, materialized at my elbow, handing me a champagne flute. Her eyes darted from me to Chloe, cycling through pity, curiosity, and discomfort before landing on an expression of forced brightness. "Eleanor, you look lovely," she said, quickly adding, "Interesting color choice tonight." "Interesting indeed," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice level. My eyes were locked on Arthur. He saw Chloe. It was a 3-second play. His hand fell instantly from my back, as if I had become suddenly radioactive. His pupils dilated, his jaw slackened, and in those 3 seconds he completely forgot I existed. In that vacuum of recognition, I saw our entire marriage. Every late meeting, every hidden text, every Tuesday afternoon that George had documented. Chloe turned, her eyes meeting mine over Arthur's shoulder. She had the decency to blush, registering the mirroring dresses, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she lifted her chin, a silent, desperate declaration of confidence disguised as war. Then I noticed the diamonds in her ears. New, expensive, familiar. They were the ones Arthur had supposedly bought for his mother's birthday last month. "Those are beautiful earrings, Melissa," I commented, though my eyes never left Chloe. "Amazing how some women can wear that kind of expensive jewelry to work events. Must be nice to have that kind of income." Melissa coughed into her champagne. Todd materialized, his face already flushed with alcohol and barely contained excitement. "Arthur, ready to make history with this startup?" he slurred, clapping my husband on the shoulder. "Just need Eleanor's signature, and we're golden." My signature, my father's money, my inheritance funding their boys' club fantasy, while Arthur's mistress stands 10 feet away wearing my color and his diamonds. The room felt too hot, too bright, too full of people who saw me as nothing more than a checkbook with legs. "We should discuss the business plan first," I interjected, my voice cutting through their enthusiasm like cold water. "I haven't seen any documentation. No revenue projections, no market analysis. Nothing but promises and Wharton credentials." Arthur's face darkened, turning that familiar shade of red that preceded his worst moments. "Eleanor, we've discussed this." "No," I corrected him. "You've talked." I've listened. There's a difference. I took a deliberate sip of champagne, letting the bubbles lend me courage. It's $500,000, Arthur. My father's money. It's our money, Eleanor. Or have you forgotten what marriage means? His voice rose, causing nearby conversations to pause. Todd laughed nervously. Hey, let's not turn business into. Into what? I asked, turning to face Todd fully. Into due diligence? Into protecting assets? Into asking basic questions about where nearly $500,000 is going. The room had gone quiet, the tense, anticipatory hush that falls when people sense drama brewing. Chloe had moved closer, pretending to examine a floral centerpiece, but clearly eavesdropping. Arthur grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. You're embarrassing me, he hissed. I'm embarrassing you? The laugh that escaped me was hollow, brittle. That's rich, considering last night. His grip tightened. Last night was nothing. You're being dramatic. 17 seconds, I said, quietly but distinctly. Your colleagues laughed at me for 17 seconds because you were being controlling. His voice boomed now, all pretense of privacy abandoned. Even the saxophone player stopped. You always do this, Eleanor. You act like you own me, like I can't make a single decision without your permission. The entire room, 60 people in designer clothes, was watching. 50 sets of eyes, witnessing round 2 of my public execution. Chloe watched, her face unreadable, but her posture screaming anticipation. Arthur's finger jabbed toward my chest, not quite touching, but close enough to feel aggressive. Stop acting like you own me, Eleanor. You don't get to tell me where I go or who I'm with. The same words, same delivery. This time his mistress was watching. This time I was ready. I set the champagne flute down on the nearest marble-topped pedestal. The click of glass on marble sounded like a judge's gavel. Inside, 14 years of marriage were shattering. But on the outside, my hands were steady, my voice clear and loud enough for every single person to hear. You're right, I said. We're not together anymore. The silence was complete, absolute. Arthur's triumphant sneer, he thought he was winning the argument, crumbled into utter confusion. His mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish gasping for air. What did you just say? His voice cracked. I said you're right. I don't own you and you don't own me. We're done. I turned, not back toward him or Chloe's barely concealed satisfaction, but toward the exit. My heels clicked against the marble floor. Steady, rhythmic, final. Each step felt like shedding weight. Behind me, I heard a woman whisper, good for her. I walked out into the freezing December air, the city lights blurring through the tears I finally allowed to fall. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of fury, and of absolute freedom. Tonight, in front of the audience that mattered to his image, I had finally let go of control. And in losing it, I had found myself. The game was over, and the demolition was about to begin. The drive home through the thickening snow was a strange, silent pilgrimage. I had made 3 critical calls from the car. The first to Victoria, confirming she was filing the papers tomorrow. The second to Marcus, my brother, to arrange the storage unit for Arthur's entire life. And the third to Maria, the locksmith, who was due to arrive at 11 p.m. The cold, heavy feeling of being betrayed was replaced by the clean, sharp edge of action. When I reached the lobby of the tower, George was waiting. He was standing by his desk, looking like a sentinel watching for the dawn of a new war. Ms. Vance, he said, using my maiden name, which I realized I hadn't used since college. It felt foreign and right. The locksmith called. She's on her way up. Service elevator only as requested. I also took the liberty of putting some industrial-grade moving boxes in the hallway. The good kind. His quiet support, his simple recognition of my maiden name, felt like a silent, powerful endorsement. At 11 p.m. precisely, Maria arrived. She was a woman in her late 50s, with silver streaks running through her dark hair and hands that carried the honest calluses of real labor. She carried a battered toolbox and eyes that had seen too many midnight escapes and too much human foolishness. She didn't offer empty condolences or ask unnecessary questions. She simply knelt by the door and examined the lock with the quiet intensity of a surgeon. "Commercial grade," she stated, pulling out her tools. "Good bones, but outdated. Your husband never upgraded the security features, did he?" The question was rhetorical. She was already working, metal singing against metal. The sound of pins clicking and tumblers turning was the most beautiful music I had heard all night. "Men like that," she continued, speaking in quiet fragments between the sounds of her work. "They never think anyone would dare lock them out. They think entitlement is a security system. Makes my job easier." As she worked, she told me her story. 17 years ago, her ex-husband had locked her out, changed the locks while she was at her mother's funeral. She came home to her entire life, her clothes, her books, her photos, tossed onto the lawn in garbage bags, soaked by the rain. "I learned locksmithing right after that," she said, testing the new deadbolt, solid, heavy, and unforgiving. "Figured if I couldn't control much else, I could at least control who got through my door." The new keys she handed me were different from the old ones. Heavier, the edges bit into my palm. "Military grade," she said, satisfaction evident in her tone. "These can't be duplicated at some corner shop. You want copies, you come through me. My personal number's on the back of the card. For emergencies, or just to talk." With Maria's work complete, I began the systematic archaeology of ending a marriage. I moved through the condo with methodical purpose, gathering every trace of Arthur's existence. Each item required examination, classification, and preservation in a cardboard box. His Harvard MBA diploma, which he'd insisted on hanging prominently in our bedroom for inspiration, went into bubble wrap. I grabbed a Sharpie and wrote on the box, "Educated but not enlightened." The Rolex I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary, 3 months of my consulting fees, went into its original box with a single note: "Time's up." His collection of first edition business books became unread trophies. His custom golf clubs, bought with what he called a bonus but was actually our tax refund, were tagged borrowed dreams. My hands were moving faster now, fueled by the cold certainty of justice. Then, behind the golf bag, my fingers brushed against something soft. A pink cashmere scarf, expensive, and reeking, absolutely reeking, of Chloe's cloying French perfume. I held it up to the light, this undeniable evidence of the Tuesday afternoons George had described. Instead of rage, I felt a strange, profound relief. Confirmation was its own kind of freedom. I folded it carefully, placed it in its own small box, and labeled it with surgical precision: Tuesday afternoons. Personal property of your accounting department. Just before midnight, George appeared at my doorway, having used his master key to check on Maria's departure. "I brought a dolly," he said simply, then began loading boxes without being asked. We worked in comfortable silence, two allies from different worlds, united by the task of dismantling a lie. The apartment was beginning to look like a crime scene where only one person's belongings had been murdered. Every trace of Arthur was boxed, labeled, and waiting in the hallway, ready for Marcus to collect at the prearranged time. At 11:45 p.m., I sat at my laptop, crafting the email that would serve as both evidence and manifesto. The subject line: Transparency and Truth, a Necessary Update. The recipient list was comprehensive. Both sets of parents, his boss, our entire friend circle, his HR department, and, feeling a particular thoroughness, the company's board of directors list that Arthur had carelessly left open on our shared computer months ago. The email itself was surgical in its precision. I attached the security footage Sarah from IT had secretly sent me. The video of Arthur publicly humiliating me, his finger jabbing, his voice booming over the jazz quartet. I added screenshots of the credit card statements showing his Tuesday afternoon hotel charges, the ones he thought I didn't know about because he used the emergency card. My finger hovered over the schedule send button. 3 a.m. seemed right, late enough that he'd be locked out and drunk, early enough that people would read it with their morning coffee, before they had time to put on their corporate masks. The new keys felt heavy and real in my hand. The locks had been changed. The email was scheduled. The midnight operation was complete. I was finally secure. The clock on my phone ticked over to midnight with the soft, gentle chime of a grandfather clock that drifted through the thin wall between my apartment and the neighboring unit 19G. I stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by the sealed, labeled boxes of Arthur's life, savoring the silence of my newly secured space. The air already tasted cleaner, less burdened by his entitlement. Then, through my peephole, I watched the door of 19G open. Judge Evelyn Reed emerged. She was an older woman, probably in her late 60s or early 70s, always impeccably dressed. Tonight, she wore an emerald silk robe and matching slippers, carrying a silver tea service as if midnight visits were perfectly routine. She paused at the boxes lining my hallway, examining the labels with the careful, appraising attention of someone assessing courtroom evidence. Her fingers traced the words on the box labeled Tuesday afternoons, and a slow, knowing smile crossed her face. She knocked on my new, solid door with 3 precise, confident taps. "Ms. Vance," she said, using my maiden name just as George had. "I believe we have some time before the main event. Would you join me for tea?" Evelyn's apartment was exactly what I had always imagined. Book-lined walls, Persian rugs covering the dark hardwood, and furniture that whispered of old money and exquisite taste. She set the tea service on a mahogany coffee table and gestured for me to sit in a wingback chair that felt enveloping and safe. "I was a judge for 30 years, Evelyn began, pouring Earl Grey with perfectly steady hands. "Presided over every kind of human cruelty you can imagine. But the cases that truly haunted me weren't the murders or the sudden violence. It was the slow erosion of a woman's spirit, the daily diminishment disguised as marriage." She handed me a delicate china cup. "That's the worst kind of cruelty because it teaches you to be complicit in your own destruction. It teaches you to doubt your own sanity until you can barely hear your own thoughts." Her words resonated with a painful, validating truth. She moved to an antique secretary desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. "I started documenting your husband's activities 6 months ago," she said. "Not out of nosiness, you understand, but out of concern." She spread the contents across the coffee table, a devastating array of photographs with timestamps, dates noted in her precise, judicial handwriting. Every Tuesday, 1:30 p.m., Chloe arriving separately, taking the service elevator. Arthur following 10 minutes later. They leave separately around 3:30 p.m. The evidence was overwhelming in its finality. Arthur checking his phone in the lobby, Chloe entering with an oversized purse, the two of them accidentally captured in the same frame, near the elevator, carefully avoiding acknowledging each other. Evelyn had built a case with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the truth needed documentation to become justice. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, overwhelmed by the depth of her kindness and her quiet intervention. Because I was you once, Evelyn said simply. 40 years ago. Different husband, same story. But back then, nobody documented anything. Nobody helped. Women just disappeared into their marriages, and nobody asked questions until they turned up in my courtroom, broken and without proof. She gently touched one of the photographs. I promised myself I'd never let another woman go through that alone, if I could help it. Especially not a woman like you, Eleanor, who clearly had the strength to fight, but just needed the objective proof to cut the cord. The grandfather clock chimed 2:23 a.m. We heard the elevator ding. Evelyn moved quickly and silently to her door, pressing her eye to the peephole with practiced ease. He's here, she whispered, gesturing for me to join her. Through the fisheye lens, I watched Arthur stumble down the hallway, his gait uneven from alcohol and arrogance. His key card beeped against the lock once, twice, 3 times. The confusion on his face was comical, the kind of expression only absolute entitlement can produce. He tried the handle, shaking it with increasing force. Eleanor! His voice was slurred but demanding. Eleanor, open the door! He progressed from confusion to irritation to anger in the span of 30 seconds. This isn't funny. Open the door right now. Evelyn looked at me, one eyebrow raised in question. I gave a single, firm nod. She opened her door with theatrical calm, teacup still in hand, looking every inch the distinguished retired judge despite the hour. Mr. Stone, she said, her voice carrying the full authority of 3 decades on the bench. Having trouble? Arthur spun toward her, nearly losing his balance. My key. It's not working. How curious, Evelyn said, taking a deliberate sip of tea. Though I suppose it makes sense. Keys generally stop working when one no longer lives somewhere. The color drained from his face as he noticed the boxes lining the hallway, his name on every label. What is this? I believe the legal term is personal property removal, Evelyn stated, though I particularly enjoyed the labeling system. Tuesday afternoons was especially creative. She gestured toward the box with the pink scarf. Your friend, Chloe, left that behind last week. Rather careless of her. At that exact moment, Arthur's phone began buzzing incessantly. The 3 a.m. email had landed. He pulled it out, his face illuminated by the screen as notification after notification popped up. His mother, his boss, the entire board of directors. She sent it to everyone, he whispered, then louder, directed at my door. You sent it to everyone. He started pounding on the door with both fists. You can't do this. This is my home. I have rights. Evelyn calmly pulled out her phone and began recording. Please continue your performance, Mr. Stone. I'm sure Eleanor's attorney will find this very helpful. Threatening behavior, attempted forced entry, intoxicated aggression. It's all quite compelling. Arthur froze mid-pound, finally noticing the discreet security camera mounted in the corner, the one I'd installed last month after sensing the shift in our marriage. His bravado crumbled instantly. The man who'd humiliated me publicly, the man who had declared his independence from our marriage, actually whimpered. Evelyn and I exchanged a look through her doorway that spoke volumes about the particular fragility of men who mistake control for strength. She continued recording as Arthur sank to his knees in front of the door, his voice shifting to a desperate, pathetic pleading. "Eleanor, please, let's talk about this. We can work it out." "I believe she already tried talking," Evelyn said coolly, "at 2 separate company events. If the video evidence is accurate, you chose public humiliation instead of private conversation. Now, you're experiencing the consequences of that choice." Arthur finally gathered his boxes with shaking hands, muttering about lawyers and unfair treatment. As the elevator doors closed on his defeated figure, Evelyn turned to me. "Would you like to watch the sunrise, my dear? I make excellent coffee to go with dawn revelations." We settled by her window, the city still dark but beginning to stir. The reckoning had come, not with dramatics, but with dignity, witnessed by a woman who understood that justice sometimes looks like Earl Grey tea and carefully documented truth. Evelyn's coffee had grown cold in my hands as the first rays of sunlight painted the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and amber. We sat in comfortable silence, 2 women who understood that some victories taste better when shared quietly. The city woke around us, and somewhere out there, Arthur was discovering that his carefully constructed world had fundamentally shifted while he slept off his arrogance. Then, at exactly 7 a.m., my phone shattered the peace with a ringtone I'd assigned specifically to avoid. Patricia Stone, Arthur's mother. I looked at Evelyn, who nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes the most surprising allies come from unexpected places," she said softly. Patricia's voice, usually sharp with disapproval and thick with Connecticut breeding, trembled like autumn leaves. "Eleanor, I've seen the email, the video, everything. What has my son done?" For 14 years, this woman had treated me like a lesser being, the daughter of a blue-collar foreman who had somehow tricked her precious Arthur into marriage. She'd made condescending comments about my clothes, suggested I take etiquette classes, and once told her country club friends that Arthur had married down for love, poor thing. Now, her voice carried something I'd never heard before: shame. "He did exactly what you raised him to believe he could do, Patricia," I said, surprising myself with the unflinching steadiness in my voice. "Take what he wanted without consequences, lie without repercussion." The sharp intake of breath on the other end might have been a sob. "I raised him better than this. His father would be appalled. His father was having an affair with his secretary when he died, Patricia," I countered without malice, simply stating fact. Arthur learned from the best. The silence stretched between us, years of pretense crumbling in a matter of seconds. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smaller, older. I suspected, but I couldn't face it, just like I couldn't face what Arthur was becoming. "I'm keeping the Christmas china you gave me," I said, looking at the morning light dancing across Evelyn's coffee table. "It's the only thing from your family worth holding on to." Another pause, heavy with unspoken acknowledgments. "Keep it all, dear," she whispered. "The silver, the crystal, everything I insisted you weren't good enough to inherit. You earned it by surviving him." She hung up without a goodbye, but somehow it felt like the most honest conversation we'd ever had. I realized she wasn't an ally, but a casualty, another woman whose life had been damaged by Arthur's generational entitlement. My phone immediately buzzed with another call. Sarah from IT, the one who'd sent me the party video. Her voice was electric with vindication. "Eleanor, you're not going to believe what I found. Actually, scratch that, you probably will. Evelyn poured fresh coffee as I put Sarah on speaker, her judicial instincts clearly interested in this new evidence. After I saw that video last night, I did some digging with my admin access, Sarah continued. Your husband has been using company resources for everything. Hotel rooms booked as client meetings, expensive dinners expensed as business development. I tracked his corporate card. Every Tuesday afternoon at the Marriott, charged to the Henderson account. Evelyn raised an eyebrow at the mention of the Henderson account. That's our biggest client. It gets worse, Sarah said, her typing audible through the phone. That startup he's been pushing, the one with Todd, I found the incorporation documents. It doesn't exist. Todd has been investigated for fraud twice, once in Boston, once in Chicago. The whole thing was a con to get your inheritance. My legs went weak. I sank into Evelyn's wingback chair, the weight of what I'd almost lost crushing down on me. $500,000. My father's life work, nearly stolen by the man who'd vowed to protect me. It was no longer just about betrayal, it was criminal intent. I forwarded everything to HR and Mr. Davidson, his boss, Sarah continued. Also sent copies to the SEC whistleblower department. The fraud division absolutely loves this kind of detailed expense fraud. By the time I ended the call, my phone was exploding with messages. The digital unraveling of Arthur's reputation was happening in real time. Jennifer from legal. We never liked how he talked about you. Tom from sales. That video was brutal. You handled it with class. Even Todd's wife, Melissa, sent a text. I'm leaving him too. Found out about the fraud investigation. You inspired me to stop ignoring red flags. But the message that stopped me cold came from Mr. Davidson himself, Arthur's boss. Ms. Vance, I apologize for our company culture that enabled this behavior. Mr. Stone's employment is under review pending investigation of expense fraud. Would you consider consulting for us? We could use someone with your dignity and strategic thinking. Please call at your convenience. I screenshot everything, creating my own forensic folder. Victoria would want documentation of the complete collapse. At 10 a.m., George called from the lobby. Ms. Vance, there's a flower delivery here. 3 dozen roses. I've refused them as you requested, but the delivery guy says they're paid for, and he can't take them back. Donate them to the local children's hospital, I said. Tell them they're from an anonymous donor who is celebrating freedom. With pleasure, George replied. Also, there's a young man here who says he's Mr. Stone's brother. Peter, Arthur's younger brother, the one who had just finished law school. Send him up, George, I said. Witnesses were always valuable, Evelyn had taught me. I looked at the morning light. The reckoning wasn't just coming. It was having a full, documented conversation, and it was taking calls. I was ready for Peter. Peter Stone arrived looking uncomfortable, his resemblance to Arthur softened by genuine embarrassment and the lack of his brother's self-satisfied arrogance. He stood in Evelyn's doorway, shifting his weight like a child called to the principal's office. Eleanor, I'm sorry to bother you, he mumbled. Arthur said if I came here and talked to you, he'd pay off my student loans, $90,000. But I'm guessing that's not happening, is it? He doesn't have $90,000, Peter, I said gently, offering him a seat. He's been living off my income for 2 years. His salary barely covers his car payment and his wardrobe. Peter's face went through several expressions: disbelief, calculation, and then a cold, pure anger. That lying piece of sorry, Judge Reed, he apologized, glancing at Evelyn. He told me you were the one overspending, that you were bleeding him dry with your shopping habits. My shopping habits, I corrected him. Consist of buying groceries and occasionally replacing worn-out work clothes. Would you like some coffee, Peter? There are things about your brother you should probably know. Over the next hour, Peter revealed more pieces of Arthur's hidden history. The gambling debts from his MBA days that Patricia had quietly paid, the previous engagement to a banker's daughter that ended when her father discovered Arthur's lies about his family's wealth, the investment schemes at his first job that HR buried to avoid scandal. I always wondered why he was so secretive about certain things, Peter said, staring into his coffee. Now it makes sense. He wasn't protecting family privacy. He was protecting his con game. As he left, he turned at the door. Eleanor, for what it's worth, the family knew you were too good for him, even Mom, though she'd never admit it. We just didn't know how to tell you. The unraveling was complete. Arthur's entire life was built on sand, and the tide was rapidly coming in. At 3:30 p.m., George called again. Ms. Vance, there's a young woman here. Chloe Mills. She says she has information you need. I looked at Victoria, who had arrived for our strategy session. Mistresses often become star witnesses, she said quietly. Let her up, Eleanor. Chloe arrived looking nothing like the confident, burgundy-clad woman from the party. Her designer dress had been replaced with jeans and a wrinkled sweater. Her eyes were red-rimmed, mascara smudged, her posture defeated. I'm sorry, she said before even sitting down. I'm so sorry. Evelyn, ever the gracious hostess, moved toward the kitchen. I'll make tea. Chloe collapsed into a chair, tears flowing freely. I didn't know he was really married. I knew he was married, but he said you were separated, living separate lives. He said you were crazy, vindictive, that you were trying to take everything in the divorce. When did it start? I asked, surprised by my own steady voice. 8 months ago. He approached me at a conference in San Francisco, said his marriage had been over for years, but his wife, you wouldn't accept it. He painted himself as this victim, trapped by a controlling woman. She accepted the tea from Evelyn with shaking hands. He was so convincing. He showed me around your apartment like he owned it, talked about selling it after the divorce was final. What did he tell you about my father's inheritance? I asked, wanting to hear the final, calculated cruelty. Chloe looked directly at me. He said the $500,000 was actually his trust fund that you'd stolen, that you were planning to bleed him dry and then divorce him. The calculated cruelty of his lies took my breath away. He hadn't just cheated. He had inverted our entire reality to seduce a woman barely out of college. Victoria pulled out her recorder. Chloe, would you be willing to repeat this on record? Chloe nodded, wiping her nose with a tissue Evelyn provided. He promised me everything. A promotion to senior accountant. Marriage, once the divorce was done. A life together, funded by the sale of the apartment. She had been played not just as a lover, but as a business asset. There's more, Chloe said, pulling out her phone. He sent me photos of jewelry he was going to buy me, screenshots of real estate listings for our future home, all dated months ago, proving he was planning this while still pretending to work on your marriage. My phone rang again. It was Marcus, my brother. His voice was tight with controlled fury. Eleanor, you need to know something. I was organizing Arthur's boxes in the storage unit when I found something in his golf bag. What kind of something, Marcus? Bank statements. He has a separate account you don't know about. He's been siphoning money from your joint account for 3 years. Small amounts, $700 here, $1,200 there. It adds up to almost $40,000. The rage that flooded through me was different from the hurt of betrayal. This was clean, pure anger, like fire burning away the last threads connecting me to Arthur. Send me photos of everything, Marcus. Immediately. I could handle this the family way, Eleanor. Make sure he understands consequences. No, I said firmly, looking at Victoria's professional, predatory smile. The legal way will hurt him more. Criminal charges for embezzlement last longer than bruises. The evidence file was now complete. Fraud, theft, documented infidelity, constructive abandonment, and the complete collapse of his professional life. Arthur hadn't just cheated. He had legally played himself out of his own divorce. The time for talking was over. Now it was time for the final, devastating legal move. 3 weeks passed in a dizzying blur of paperwork, depositions, and strategic silence. Victoria had executed option 2. Slow play it, letting Arthur marinate in uncertainty while his world continued collapsing. The threat of SEC investigation and criminal fraud charges for embezzlement, backed by Sarah's damning evidence and Marcus's bank statements, was a wrecking ball to his once perfect image. Thursday arrived with an email from Arthur's lawyer, requesting immediate mediation. Victoria laughed out loud when she read it. They want to avoid court, she confirmed, tapping the screen. Good sign. Means they know they're losing. The mediation was scheduled for the following Monday in a sterile, downtown conference room. I chose my best suit, not for him, but for myself, a dark charcoal Armani, tailored and sharp, armor for battle. I already knew I had one. Victoria flanked me like a bodyguard. Arthur entered the room looking diminished. His face was bloodshot, his usual confidence cracked, but not broken. He wore his Harvard tie, the one he wore to important meetings, and his lawyer, an older man who looked utterly exhausted, shuffled papers with the resignation of someone who knew this was just procedure. The looming criminal charges made contest impossible. Arthur tried his old smile, the one that used to make me forgive everything. Eleanor, he started, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. We can work this out. Remember what we had. Remember Paris? I pulled out the folder Sarah had compiled. Inside were his expense reports showing he had charged our Paris anniversary trip. Every flight, every hotel, every expensive dinner. To his company as client entertainment. I also had the text message, screenshots of him texting Chloe from the Eiffel Tower. I slid the folder across the table without a word. His lawyer's face went pale as he quickly read the contents. This could be criminal fraud. It is criminal fraud, Victoria confirmed, her voice cold and precise. Along with embezzlement from marital assets, constructive abandonment, and documented infidelity. We have a signed statement from Ms. Mills detailing his deceptive pattern and fraudulent promises. We have bank statements proving he systematically stole from a joint account. Arthur reached for my hand across the table. I pulled back as if his touch might infect me with his delusion. Eleanor, please. We had good times. The only thing I remember, I said, my voice carrying the weight of a finally spoken truth, is paying for those good times while you plan to steal my inheritance. Victoria leaned forward, taking control of the room. Here are our terms, counsel. They are non-negotiable. Ms. Vance keeps all assets, including the condo, savings, and investments. Mr. Stone keeps nothing, except his personal belongings, which have already been delivered to his storage unit. She paused for emphasis. He signs a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, preventing him from discussing the marriage or divorce in exchange for one thing. We do not pursue criminal charges for the $40,000 he stole, nor do we submit the expense fraud evidence to the state attorney's office. Arthur's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, words like prison and SEC cutting through the murmur. Arthur's face crumbled, like old plaster finally giving way to water damage. The man who had publicly humiliated me, who had stolen from me, who had planned to take everything while painting me as crazy, finally understood. He wasn't the one in control anymore. He never really had been. He had just been living in the delusion I'd paid for. And now the bill had come due. His pen hovered over the NDA agreement for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. His hand trembled slightly as he finally signed, the sound of ink on paper marking the legal death of our marriage. His lawyer gathered the documents with the efficiency of someone eager to leave, muttering about filing deadlines. As they stood to leave, Arthur looked at me one last time, his mouth opening as if to say something, but Victoria raised her hand, pointing to the freshly signed NDA. He closed his mouth and shuffled out like a man who had aged a decade in an hour. 12 minutes. That was all it took to legally dissolve 14 years. As we filed out, Arthur lingered by the courthouse steps. "I loved you once," he said, the words falling flat in the humid air. I paused, Evelyn's wisdom flowing through me like inherited strength. "No, Arthur," I stated simply. "You loved what I provided. You loved the stability, the money, the cover for your inadequacies. You loved the idea that you had a high-earning wife to bankroll your fragile ambition. There is a fundamental difference between loving someone and loving what they do for you." He opened his mouth, closed it, then simply turned and walked away. His figure grew smaller against the city backdrop until he turned a corner and vanished. I knew with absolute certainty I would never see him again, and the thought brought only peace, clean and complete, like the click of a well-oiled lock. The 3 weeks following the mediation were a quiet, therapeutic rush of paperwork and apartment reorganization. With the legal death of the marriage complete, I began the process of reclaiming my physical and emotional territory. The condo, which had once felt like a shared stage for Arthur's performance, was now simply mine, and the task of cleansing it of his presence felt like a sacred duty. I reclaimed spaces that had been his by default. The home office where he had conducted his sham client calls and planned his Tuesday afternoon betrayals was gutted. I replaced his heavy, masculine oak desk with a sleek, minimalist glass design, placing it so I could look directly out at the skyline while working, a view that no longer felt like his possession but my inspiration. The walk-in closet, which had been dominated by his designer suits and golf attire, now held only my clothes, spread out luxuriously with ample room to breathe. I donated his collection of self-help and business books, all titles about the art of the deal and mastering your domain, to a local library, preferring that someone else benefit from the unread trophies. Evelyn checked in daily, bringing not just tea but quiet wisdom. She often just sat with me, watching the cleaning crew or the movers. "This isn't just about cleaning, Eleanor," she observed one afternoon, watching me scrub the granite counter where I'd made his last coffee. "It's about eradicating the ghost of who you were. Every piece of his removal is an affirmation of the woman you are becoming." The building's residents had rapidly shifted their perception of me. I was no longer Arthur's wife, but Eleanor Vance, the woman who had executed the most legendary, dignified takedown in the tower's history. George still worked the front desk, and young executives, primarily women, would nod at me in the elevator with a look of quiet respect. The story had become building legend, the wife who changed her own locks and sent her husband's life to storage. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Patricia Stone called to arrange a visit. She arrived at the apartment carrying a beautiful antique leather case. I recognized it immediately, the family jewelry she had guarded throughout my marriage, like I might steal it. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it on my coffee table. "I was wrong about you," she said without preamble, age having worn away her capacity for pretense. "Wrong to treat you as less than. Wrong to raise a son who could—" She stopped, composing herself. "I failed him, and that failure hurt you." We sat across from each other, two women examining the collateral damage one man had created between them. She opened the case, revealing pieces I'd only seen in faded family photos: an Art Deco bracelet, pearl earrings from the 1920s, a heavy sapphire ring that had belonged to Arthur's grandmother. "These should have been yours from the beginning, Eleanor," Patricia said, her voice strained. "I withheld them out of snobbery, thinking you weren't good enough for our family. The truth is, we weren't good enough for you. We would never be friends. There was too much history, too much hurt. But in that moment, we found a genuine, painful understanding." She told me Arthur was living with Peter now, working a low-level job at an airport rental car location, dating a woman named Jennifer who believed he was divorced because his wife had been unfaithful. "I hope he's learned," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she knew better. "You taught him the lesson you couldn't, Patricia," I replied. "That actions have consequences." Before leaving, she embraced me, a real, genuine hug. "Thank you for teaching him the lesson I couldn't," she whispered against my ear. By September, my consulting firm had tripled its client base. The story of the woman who locked out her life had become Chicago business legend. Female executives, especially, sought me out, specifically wanting the strategic mind that could orchestrate such a complete reversal of power. "If you can plan a divorce like a military operation, Eleanor," one CEO told me over lunch, "imagine what you can do for my merger." I moved my office to a building with windows that actually opened, a detail that felt monumentally important. Fresh air whenever I wanted it, no climate control beyond my own preferences. The physical space was cleansed, the legal ties were severed, and the career was accelerating. But the final test was yet to come. The social victory, the public, unscripted moment of triumph, was scheduled for New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve arrived with a dramatic, swirling snowstorm outside. It was cold enough to make the city lights sparkle, but inside, the atmosphere in my apartment was electric. My personal victory felt vast, yet I still harbored a low-grade anxiety about one thing: the building's annual rooftop party. The Condo tower was a tightly knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew the whole story. I had avoided all large gatherings for 3 months, maintaining a dignified distance. The thought of facing a room full of people who had witnessed my public humiliation and then my subsequent triumph felt overwhelming. I knew they supported me, but the sheer visibility was daunting. An invitation, handwritten by Evelyn herself, had been slipped under my door the week before. "You need to be seen, thriving, Eleanor. It's not about him anymore. It's about you." I was still debating whether to go when Evelyn appeared at my door at 7 p.m., holding a velvet jewelry box. "Absolutely not declining, my dear," she announced, sweeping past my protestations. "This is the closing argument of your case." She opened the box, revealing a pair of diamond cufflinks. "These were my late husband's," she said, her voice softening. "He was a real man, the kind who supported his wife's success instead of trying to steal it. I had them made into earrings after he passed." She fastened them to my ears with gentle, steady fingers. The diamonds, set in a subtle gold frame, caught the light like trapped stars. Wear them tonight. Let them remind you what actual partnership looked like. My choice of dress for the evening was deliberate. Not the burgundy of humiliation, not the black of mourning, but fire engine red. The kind of red that announces arrival, demands attention, and declares war and victory simultaneously. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I hadn't seen in 14 years. Not Arthur's wife or anyone's victim, but Eleanor Vance, 41 years old and finally fully alive. The rooftop venue, usually sleek and modern, sparkled with string lights and massive heat lamps fighting against the December cold. The moment I stepped off the elevator, the low hum of conversation stuttered to a halt. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of scandal this time, but something else. Recognition, perhaps respect. George, dressed in his formal uniform for the event, announced with unusual volume, "Ms. Eleanor Vance." The emphasis on my maiden name was deliberate, each syllable a declaration. The applause started instantly, not an awkward clap, but a genuine wave that spread through the crowd like wildfire. Dr. Kim from 12th Street raised her glass. The Johnsons from 8C nodded approvingly. Even the young tech couples, who usually ignored anyone over 30, were clapping. It took me a moment to understand. They weren't applauding my divorce or my drama. They were applauding my courage, the simple, difficult act of refusing to disappear quietly. I was 2 glasses of champagne into actual enjoyment when the elevator chimed at 10:47 p.m. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of dramatic timing. Arthur stepped out. He had Chloe on his arm, his chin raised in that familiar, desperate way that meant he was pretending confidence. He wore his most expensive suit, the one I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary. Chloe wore black and looked like she would rather be anywhere else on earth. The room's energy shifted immediately, but not in the way Arthur had calculated. Conversations didn't stop. They deliberately continued, the voices perhaps a bit louder. Backs turned with synchronized precision. When Arthur approached the bar, the bartender suddenly needed to check inventory in the back room. When he tried to join a group near the windows, they dispersed like smoke, reforming elsewhere. Chloe's face cycled through mortification to understanding to raw shame. She wasn't his new girlfriend being introduced to society. She was a prop in his revenge fantasy, and everyone knew it. When she caught my eye across the room, her expression crumbled. This wasn't what he had promised her. Arthur, red-faced and desperate, made a beeline for me, but George materialized from nowhere, joined by 2 other security men I'd never seen before. They formed a subtle but unmistakable wall. "Sir," George said, his voice carrying across the now quiet rooftop, "you are not on the resident list. I'll have to ask you to leave, unless a current resident vouches for you." The silence that followed was total. 60 people, residents who had lived here for years, who had shared elevators and small talk with Arthur, who had attended his 4th of July parties. Not one person moved. Not one voice spoke up. The rejection was absolute, devastating in its unanimous condemnation. Arthur's face went from red to purple. "This is ridiculous. I lived here for—" "Past tense, Mr. Stone," Evelyn interrupted, approaching with the authority of her former profession. "The building is quite particular about security these days." At exactly midnight, as if orchestrated by fate, Evelyn took the microphone for the traditional New Year's toast. The crowd turned toward her, effectively giving Arthur their backs. She raised her champagne, the diamonds on her wrist glittering, and spoke with the crystal clarity of judgment. "To new beginnings, she started, her eyes finding mine across the crowd. To women who realize their worth after years of being told they have none. To men who learn that consequences, like karma, always come due. She paused, taking a deliberate sip, and then her voice ringing out. And to Ms. Eleanor Vance, who reminded us all that sometimes the best renovation you can do to a home is removing the trash. The laughter that erupted wasn't cruel. It was cathartic, a collective release. Glasses were raised toward me from every direction. Someone started clapping, and this time it grew into something that felt like vindication. Arthur's composure finally shattered completely. This is conspiracy. You've all been turned against me. This is illegal. You ruined your own life, Evelyn said calmly, her microphone still on. Eleanor just stopped being your cleanup crew. Chloe broke. She pulled away from Arthur's arm, walked directly to me through the crowd that parted like water. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming. I was an idiot. He played me, just like. She stopped, shaking her head. I'm just sorry. She headed for the elevator without looking back. Arthur, now alone and surrounded by people who had collectively decided he didn't exist, began what could only be described as a public meltdown. As building security escorted him out, he made one last desperate proclamation. I'll destroy you in court, Eleanor. You'll get nothing. Victoria, who had been quietly sipping champagne in the corner, laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. With what money? Your assets are frozen pending fraud investigation. Your job is gone. Your mistress just publicly dumped you. Even your mother took Eleanor's side. She raised her glass mockingly. Happy New Year, Arthur. The crowd turned back to me, not with pity or awkwardness, but with solidarity. The countdown to midnight began again. Evelyn had actually paused it for the drama. As the ball dropped on the screen, I stood surrounded by neighbors who had become witnesses and witnesses who had become allies. The new year arrived with cheers and champagne, and for the first time in 14 years, I celebrated without wondering what mood Arthur would be in tomorrow. I was free. January dissolved into February and then March. Each day built toward the final, legal punctuation mark, the formal, uncontested divorce hearing. The courthouse in downtown Chicago stood like a monument to other people's endings. But for me, it represented a beginning. It was the same building where Evelyn had once presided over countless divorces, and now it would host mine. The morning of June 15th arrived, gray and humid, the kind of weather that makes everything feel heavy, except my heart. I arrived early, flanked by Victoria, who looked less like a lawyer and more like an admiral at the helm of a victorious fleet. Arthur appeared diminished in every way. His suit was clearly borrowed, hanging loose on shoulders that had lost their arrogant set. His lawyer, a public defender assigned after Arthur's funds dried up, looked utterly exhausted before the proceedings even began, shuffling papers with the resignation of someone who knew this was just procedure. The looming embezzlement charges had removed any possibility of contest. He couldn't fight without risking criminal prosecution, a risk even his narcissism couldn't stomach. The judge, a woman about Evelyn's age with similarly sharp eyes, reviewed the documents with efficiency. She was all business, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Stone," she stated, looking over her glasses, "do you contest any of the terms set forth in this dissolution of marriage, which grants Ms. Vance full ownership of the marital residence and keeps all financial assets obtained during the marriage separate due to documented financial malfeasance?" "No, Your Honor." His voice cracked on the honorific. 12 minutes. That was all it took to legally dissolve 14 years. The gavel came down with a sound like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. As we filed out, Arthur lingered by the courthouse steps, his face working through emotions like he was trying to find the right one to wear. "I loved you once," he said, the words falling flat in the humid air. I paused, Evelyn's wisdom flowing through me like inherited strength. "No, Arthur," I stated simply. "You loved what I provided. You loved the stability, the money, the cover for your inadequacies. You loved the idea that you had a high-earning wife to bankroll your fragile ambition. There is a fundamental difference between loving someone and loving what they do for you." He opened his mouth, closed it, then simply turned and walked away. His figure grew smaller against the city backdrop until he turned a corner and vanished. I knew with absolute certainty I would never see him again, and the thought brought only peace, clean and complete, like the final, satisfying click of a well-oiled lock. 2 weeks later, Patricia Stone called to arrange a final visit. She arrived at my apartment carrying the leather case containing the family jewelry. We sat across from each other, 2 women examining the wreckage. "I failed him," she confessed softly, touching the sapphire ring. "And I failed myself by ignoring the warning signs in his father. Arthur learned that you could be cruel, and the woman would still stay. You, Eleanor, broke that cycle." She told me Arthur was now living with Peter, working a minimum wage job at an airport rental car location, dating a woman named Jennifer who believed he was divorced because his wife had been unfaithful. "I only destroyed the fiction, Patricia," I replied. "The rest was always there, waiting to be exposed." Before leaving, she embraced me, a real, genuine hug. "Thank you for teaching him the lesson I couldn't," she whispered against my ear. By September, my consulting firm was booming. I had tripled its client base. Female executives sought me out, wanting the strategic mind that could orchestrate such a complete reversal of power. If you can plan a divorce like a military operation, Eleanor, one CO told me over lunch, imagine what you can do for my merger. I moved my office to a building with windows that actually opened, a small detail that felt monumentally important. Fresh air whenever I wanted it, no climate control beyond my own preferences. The physical space was cleansed, the legal ties were severed, and the career was accelerating. But the final, humanistic piece of the victory was Evelyn's idea, and it would change both our lives forever. By October, the success of my consulting business was undeniable, but the true, deep satisfaction came from the unexpected partnership I had forged with Judge Evelyn Reed. Our weekly gatherings for tea and discussion had evolved into something substantial, something necessary. "We need to formalize this, Eleanor," Evelyn declared one Tuesday afternoon, as we sat in her apartment watching the city below. "Your corporate strategy, combined with my judicial insight, we can do more than just talk over Earl Grey." And so we founded the Autonomy Club, a support and strategy group for women learning to control their own doors, both literal and metaphorical. Evelyn and I were the co-founders. We met weekly, hosting a growing circle of women in the building's communal event space, women who were seeking clarity, seeking courage, seeking the permission to leave unhealthy situations. Evelyn, the retired judge who had seen it all, offered cold, hard legal and psychological analysis. I offered the pragmatic, strategic steps for financial and logistical escape. Our demographic spanned from young professionals in their 20s navigating toxic relationships to women in their 60s and 70s who realized they had endured too much, too long. "My ex locked me out 20 years ago," a woman named Elaine shared, tears in her eyes. "But Evelyn, you taught me the real lock was in my head." "Exactly," Evelyn would say, leaning forward with her signature authority. The key to that lock, my dear, is your autonomy. And autonomy is non-negotiable. We talked about finances, safety, emotional gaslighting, and the sheer logistics of moving a life. We should write a book, Evelyn suggested one afternoon, watching the group of a dozen women sharing stories of escape and triumph. Call it Changing the Locks, a guide to reclaiming your life. Maybe, I said, though I was already thinking about chapters and structure, about how truth could become instruction for others trapped behind doors they thought they couldn't change. Now, on this quiet Tuesday morning in late October, I stood in my apartment, truly, completely mine, watching another sunrise paint the city gold. The locks had evolved again. They were smart locks controlled by my phone, a technology that felt symbolic. No physical keys to copy, no mechanical tumblers to pick. Just encrypted, digital security I controlled completely. George still worked the front desk, still called me MS Vance with obvious pride. Young women in the building sought me out for advice about relationships, careers, and self-worth. Last week, a 28-year-old named Emma asked me the question I'd once asked myself. How do you know when it's time to leave, Eleanor? How do you know the lock is real? I told her, channeling Evelyn's wisdom that had become my own, that had become ours. It's in your belief that you need someone else's permission to be free. The lock keeping you trapped isn't on any door. The moment you understand that you already have the key, that you have the internal power to turn it, you'll know it's time. My phone buzzed. Another unknown number, probably Arthur trying again through some cheap app or borrowed phone. I deleted it without reading, without anger, without any emotion at all. Some doors, once locked, should remain that way. I made my coffee, 1 sugar, oat milk, prepared exactly how I preferred, and smiled at this small rebellion that had become routine. Freedom lived in these tiny choices as much as the dramatic ones. Every preference expressed, every boundary maintained, every decision made without seeking approval was another tumbler clicking into place in the lock of my own autonomy. The morning light caught the diamonds Evelyn had given me, the ones that belonged to a man who had understood partnership. They sparkled against my wrist as I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast, to endings that become beginnings, to locks that protect instead of trap, to the woman I'd become by refusing to remain who I was expected to be. The lock that changed everything wasn't just on my door. It was the one I'd finally installed in my own heart, securing my worth from anyone who might try to diminish it again. And that lock, that one would never be changed. If my story of reclaiming my life, my name, and my financial freedom resonated with you, know this: the most dangerous lock is the one we put on our own potential, telling ourselves we can't afford to be free. You can. Evelyn and I proved that you are never too old, too entrenched, or too intimidated to execute your own midnight demolition. Find your George, find your Maria, and especially find your Evelyn. Your wisdom is your weapon, and your quiet allies are your army. What was the single moment in this story, the 17 seconds of laughter, the discovery of the pink scarf, or Evelyn's midnight toast, that triggered your greatest moment of clarity? Drop it in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story. Your journey starts now.